The recipe book sat on the counter, its cracked leather cover gleaming faintly under the golden light of Sophie Greer's kitchen. The title, Family Recipes, was embossed in elegant cursive, though the gold foil had mostly worn away, leaving just a whisper of its former glory. Sophie brushed her fingers over it as though it were a relic, something sacred. In many ways, it was. This book had belonged to her grandmother, Eleanor Greer, the matriarch of their family and the keeper of every tradition they held dear. Sophie had spent the better part of the afternoon dusting flour off countertops and clearing away the remnants of her earlier baking experiments. The smell of ginger and cloves lingered in the air, a faint echo of Christmases past, but it did little to calm her nerves. She had agreed to host the Greer family Christmas dinner for the first time this year, and as the hours ticked closer to Christmas morning, the weight of that decision pressed heavier on her shoulders. There was one thing in particular Sophie couldn't stop thinking about: Eleanor's Christmas crown cake. Every Christmas, the cake had been the centerpiece of their family feast, sitting proudly on a pedestal in the middle of the dining room table. Its golden, spiced bundt form was drizzled with a shimmering glaze and topped with sugared cranberries arranged in the shape of a wreath. Around the cranberries, powdered sugar dusted in the pattern of stars created a glistening halo that made the whole dessert look otherworldly. Eleanor always said it symbolized hope and unity, a star to guide them through the trials of the year ahead. And now Sophie was supposed to recreate it. Supposed to? Sophie muttered aloud, flipping through the pages of the recipe book with increasing frustration. She'd been searching for the better part of an hour, but there was no sign of the recipe. No Christmas crown cake, no hints, no mentions, not even an offhand note about its glaze. She ran her finger down the index for the third time, her brow furrowing as she hit sea casserole, caramel tart, chicken pot pie. Nothing. She slammed the book shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet kitchen. Her reflection in the nearby window caught her eye. Snow was falling in lazy flakes outside, blanketing the street and softening the world. It should have felt serene, but to Sophie, it only emphasized her isolation. Her tiny house, with its old appliances and mismatched dishes, felt woefully inadequate for hosting her large, opinionated family. "Great job, Sophie," she muttered to herself, pacing the length of the kitchen. "You thought you could play hostess, and now you can't even find the recipe for the one thing that actually matters." The truth was, Sophie had volunteered to host on a whim, desperate attempt to reconnect with her family. Things hadn't been the same since Eleanor passed away 3 years ago. The family had splintered, gathering in smaller groups or not at all. The big, boisterous Christmases of her childhood had become memories, fading faster with each passing year. Sophie wanted to bring them back. She wanted to remind everyone what it felt like to gather around the same table, laughing over shared stories, passing dishes until plates overflowed. But now, as she stared down the recipe book, her resolve wavered. Without the Christmas crown cake, how could she recreate the magic Eleanor had woven so effortlessly every year? A dull ache formed behind her eyes. She closed them briefly, inhaling the warm, spiced air of the kitchen. When she opened them, her gaze fell back to the recipe book. Something about it drew her in, as though it were watching her as much as she was studying it. Reluctantly, she opened it again. As her fingers flipped through the brittle pages, she noticed something odd. A corner of a page had been folded down. It was the only folded corner in the entire book, standing out like a deliberate marker. With a frown, Sophie carefully unfolded the crease, revealing faint handwriting along the margin. The ink was faded, but the loops and slants of the letters were unmistakable, her grandmother's handwriting. "The recipe isn't just in the words, Sophie. It's in the memories we make while creating it." Sophie's breath caught. She traced the words with her fingertip, as though doing so might somehow bring Eleanor closer. Her grandmother had always been a little whimsical, speaking in metaphors and riddles that Sophie hadn't appreciated as a child. But now, the words felt like a lifeline, tugging her towards something just out of reach. "Memories don't bake cakes, Grandma," Sophie said under her breath, though her voice lacked the bite she'd intended. She flipped the page, hoping for more clues, and was greeted by another note, this one in a different hand. It was written in pen, the strokes heavier and slightly crooked. Her mother's handwriting. Start with the basics, you'll find the rest in the journey. Sophie stared at the words, her heart sinking and soaring all at once. Her mother, Sophie Greer, had left this note likely years ago, back when the book still sat in Eleanor's kitchen. Sophie didn't often think of her mother as sentimental. Evelyn was sharp, practical, and rarely indulged in the kind of whimsy Eleanor had thrived on. But here, in this faint scrawl, was a softer side of her mother, a reminder that maybe Evelyn understood the book's significance better than Sophie gave her credit for. Determined, Sophie flipped back through the pages, this time paying closer attention to the margins. To her surprise, she found more notes scribbled throughout the book, in different inks and handwriting styles. Some were short and practical, like, "Double the cinnamon for Dodhay likes it spicier," or "Use the glass pie dish for this one. It bakes more evenly." Others were more reflective, like, "Made this the night Eleanor told us about Dad's diagnosis." It helped somehow. The notes were like a patchwork quilt of memories, pieced together by her family over generations. They spoke of love, of loss, of quiet triumphs and shared meals that brought them back from the brink. Yet, despite the warmth these discoveries brought, there was still no trace of the Christmas crown cake. She was about to give up when she noticed something peculiar, a series of tiny stars doodled in the corners of several pages. They were simple 5-pointed sketches, drawn in pencil, some barely visible. Sophie leaned closer, noticing that the stars seemed to appear near recipes with spicy cinnamon rolls, apple pie, gingerbread cookies. It was subtle, but there was a pattern. "What are you trying to tell me, Grandma?" Sophie murmured, her voice trembling. Then, on the very last page, she found it. A simple list of spices written in Eleanor's hand. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, orange zest. It wasn't labeled, nor did it include measurements, but beneath it was a single line. "The star shines brightest when shared. Don't make it alone." Sophie stared at the words, her pulse quickening. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a message. But what did it mean? And how was she supposed to make the cake without instructions? She glanced at her phone, debating who to call for help. Her mother, Evelyn, or maybe her older sister, Emma. Both options felt fraught. Evelyn was quick to criticize, and Emma was busy juggling her 3 kids. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay not just in the book, but in the people who had written in it. Sophie picked up her phone and dialed Evelyn's number, her hands trembling. As the phone rang, she glanced back at the book, noticing something she hadn't seen before, a faint indentation on the page beneath the spice list. What was hidden there? And would Evelyn even answer? Sophie clutched the phone tighter as the ringing tone filled her kitchen. With every second that passed, she debated hanging up. It wasn't just the recipe that made her hesitant to call her mother, it was their history. Sophie Greer had a way of turning even the most casual conversation into a critique, and Sophie wasn't sure she could handle being second-guessed right now. But as the indentation on the page beneath the spice list taunted her with its mystery, she knew she couldn't figure this out alone. "Hello?" Evelyn's voice was brisk, as if she'd been halfway through folding laundry. Sophie stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. Her mind buzzed with doubts. What if Mom laughed at her for trying to make the cake? Or worse, what if she dismissed it entirely, saying it was impossible to recreate Eleanor's magic? Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. The thought of her mother's voice, sharp and practical, made her chest tighten. But the image of the empty table, the family scattered, pushed her to press the button. Sophie cleared her throat. "Hey, Mom, it's me." A pause. "Well, this is a surprise. Everything okay?" It was a simple enough question, but it carried layers Sophie didn't want to unpack right now. She took a deep breath. "I need your help. I'm trying to make Grandma's Christmas crown cake, but I can't find the recipe in the book. There are notes and clues, but they don't make sense. Another pause, longer this time. Sophie could almost hear her mother's mind turning over the request. "The crown cake?" Evelyn said finally, her voice softening. "I didn't think anyone would try making it again after she passed." "I want to bring it back," Sophie admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The family's been so scattered since she's been gone, and I thought maybe if I could get the cake right, it would feel like Christmas again." Evelyn sighed, the sound equal parts exasperation and something softer, fondness maybe. "That cake. It's not just a recipe, Sophie. Your grandmother never wrote it down because she didn't believe it was something you could just copy. It's a process, a tradition." Sophie frowned. "Then how did you learn to make it?" "I didn't, not really. I only ever helped her. It was always Eleanor's creation, but she believed it needed many hands to make it perfect. That's why she folded everyone into the process. Emma mixed the batter, your dad zested the oranges, and you—" Evelyn trailed off, and Sophie's heart clenched as she waited for the memory. "You used to stand on that little stool and dust the stars with powdered sugar?" Evelyn said softly. Sophie bit her lip, blinking back tears. She could almost hear her grandmother's laughter, smell the warm spices in the air as Eleanor handed her the tiny sieve and whispered, "Gentle hands, Sophie, like falling snow." "But how am I supposed to do that now?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm on my own." "You're not," Evelyn said firmly. "I'll come over." Sophie froze. You will?" "Yes. If you're serious about making that cake, you'll need help. And patience. Plenty of patience." Evelyn's tone lightened. "Besides, it's been a long time since we made anything together." The offer stunned Sophie. She couldn't remember the last time her mother had willingly stepped into her kitchen. Evelyn's home kitchen, with its sleek appliances and immaculate counters, had always been the unofficial headquarters for family meals. But before Sophie could second-guess the offer, Evelyn added, "I'll bring some things. The recipe's in the memories, after all. Let's see what we can dig up together." Evelyn arrived half an hour later, carrying a small box of supplies and wearing a thick wool coat that still smelled faintly of pine from her Christmas tree. Sophie hadn't expected her mother to drop everything and come over, but here she was, standing in the doorway with a determined glint in her eye. "Let's get started," Evelyn said, brushing the snow from her boots. They sat at the kitchen table, the recipe book between them. Sophie explained the notes she'd found, the folded corners, the stars doodled in the margins, and the list of spices on the final page. Evelyn examined each clue with quiet focus, her fingers tracing the lines of Eleanor's handwriting. "She always did love her little puzzles," Evelyn said with a wistful smile. "Nothing was ever straightforward with her." "I think she wanted it to feel like a journey," Sophie said, "like we were earning the recipe somehow." "Or maybe she wanted us to work together to figure it out," Evelyn added. They turned back to the spice list. Evelyn tapped the page thoughtfully. "These spice, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, orange zest, they're the foundation. But the key to the cake wasn't just the flavor. It was the balance." Sophie nodded, remembering how Eleanor used to sniff the air around the mixing bowl, adjusting spices with what seemed like pure instinct. "So we start with this?" Evelyn smiled. "No, we start with the dough." The kitchen came alive with quiet chatter and the rhythmic clatter of bowls and spoons. Evelyn guided Sophie's hands as they kneaded the dough, her touch firm but patient. "You've got to feel it," Evelyn said, smiling. For the first time, Sophie saw a spark of the woman her grandmother had often described, a softer, warmer version of her mother. For the next hour, the kitchen came alive with movement and conversation. Evelyn mixed the dry ingredients while Sophie cracked eggs and measured out milk and butter. They debated over the proper consistency for the batter, laughing when Evelyn scolded Sophie for being too heavy-handed with the mixing. "You'll make it tough," Evelyn exclaimed, nudging Sophie aside to take over. "Dough is like family. It needs a gentle touch, not brute force." Sophie rolled her eyes but smiled. It was the closest they'd come to playful banter in years. As the batter came together, Evelyn pulled out a zester and began grating oranges, releasing a burst of bright citrus into the room. The aroma mingled with the warm spices, and for the first time in days, Sophie felt like she might actually pull this off. But the real challenge came when it was time to shape the cake. Evelyn explained how Eleanor had always used a specific bundt pan, one with intricate ridges that formed the crown. "Do you have one like it?" Evelyn asked. Sophie hesitated. "I have this." She held up a plain bundt pan, its edges smooth and unadorned. Evelyn frowned, but then her expression softened. "It's not the pan that makes the crown. It's the care you put into it." They poured the batter carefully, smoothing the top until it was perfect. Then, as the cake baked, Evelyn handed Sophie a small jar of cranberries and a saucepan. "Now for the jewels," she said, grinning. They worked side by side, sugaring the cranberries and preparing the glaze. Sophie watched as her mother's practiced hands moved with precision, and for the first time, she noticed how Evelyn's hair had begun to gray at the temples. "Did you ever resent helping Grandma?" Sophie asked suddenly. Evelyn paused, her hands stilling over the saucepan. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But now, I'm glad I have those memories. They're all we really have left, aren't they?" As the timer dinged, Sophie pulled the cake from the oven, its golden crust filling the kitchen with the scent of spices and citrus. But before she could feel triumph, Evelyn pointed to the spice list. "There's still one more thing missing," Evelyn said, her tone serious. "What?" Sophie asked, confused. Her mother smiled cryptically, holding up the recipe book. "Trust me, you'll know when you see it." Sophie opened the book again, studying the stars drawn in the margins. But as she tilted the page toward the light, something she hadn't noticed before began to emerge, a faint imprint hidden beneath the doodles. It wasn't just a note, it was a secret ingredient. "What is that?" Sophie asked, her heart racing. Evelyn leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Looks like Grandma left us one last clue." Sophie squinted at the faint imprint on the page, the curves and lines barely visible even under the bright kitchen light. She tilted the book again, angling it toward the overhead lamp. Slowly, the lines began to form a shape, not words, but a symbol. "It's a star?" Sophie said, brushing her fingers over the faint outline. Evelyn leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Not just any star," she murmured. "That's Eleanor's star." "Grandma always said the star was a reminder," Evelyn continued, "to follow the light, even when things felt dark. It's not just about finding your way, it's about trusting that the path will lead you where you're meant to be." Sophie traced the faint outline of the star, her chest tightening. For so long, she'd felt lost, unsure of how to bring the family back together. But now, with her mother beside her, the meaning of the star seemed clearer than ever. Love was the light that guided them. Sophie blinked, confused. "Her star?" Evelyn nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. She used to draw it everywhere, on the backs of envelopes, on grocery lists, even in the margins of her crossword puzzles. It was her little signature, like a stamp of approval. Sophie stared at the star, her heart racing. So, what does it mean here? Is it just her way of saying we're on the right track? Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced the outline of the star with a fingertip, her expression thoughtful. Maybe. Or maybe it's pointing us to something we've missed. Sophie sighed, sitting back in her chair. Another puzzle. Great. But even as she said it, she couldn't help feeling a flicker of excitement. The recipe was no longer just an elusive goal, it was becoming an adventure, a way to reconnect not only with her grandmother, but with her mother too. Evelyn stood and began rummaging through the box of supplies she'd brought. She pulled out a folded piece of parchment paper, its edges browned and fragile with age. "I found this tucked in the back of one of Grandma's old cookbooks," Evelyn said, smoothing it out on the counter. Sophie leaned in, her breath catching. The parchment was covered in handwritten notes, scrawled in Eleanor's familiar script. But instead of a recipe, it seemed to be a set of instructions, like a guide to creating the perfect Christmas crown cake. Step 1, Evelyn read aloud. Gather your stars. They are the light that guides the way. She glanced up at Sophie, her brow raised. Does that mean anything to you? Sophie shook her head, confused. Stars again, but I don't get it. What stars? Evelyn tapped the recipe book, the ones in the margins. Look, there's a pattern. Sophie flipped back through the book, studying the doodled stars more closely. They appeared sporadically at first, scattered across the pages, but as she turned each one, she realized they were clustering toward a single section of the book. Page 27, Evelyn said, stopping Sophie's hand. The stars surrounded a recipe for a simple spiced orange loaf, one of Eleanor's lesser-known creations. It wasn't nearly as iconic as the Christmas crown cake, but as Sophie studied the page, she noticed something odd. Beneath the title, Eleanor had written in faint, looping script, "For those who seek the crown, follow the light." The light, Sophie whispered. She keeps talking about light. What is this, a treasure map? Not far off, Evelyn said, her voice tinged with amusement. They decided to bake the orange loaf as a trial, following the notes in the margins. The kitchen filled with the bright, zesty scent of oranges mingled with warm cinnamon and cloves, but something felt off. The cake turned out perfectly fine golden, moist and fragrant, but as Sophie sliced into it, she realized it wasn't the answer. This isn't it, she said, frustrated. It's good, but it's not the cake. There's nothing special about it. Evelyn didn't argue. She was staring at the recipe book again, her lips pursed in thought. Maybe the loaf wasn't meant to be the final step. Maybe it's just another piece of the puzzle. Sophie groaned, resting her forehead on the counter. How many pieces are there? I just want to make one stupid cake. Evelyn chuckled, brushing flour off her hands. You're missing the point, Sophie. It's not just about the cake. It's about what we're doing right now. Sophie lifted her head, glaring. You mean fumbling around with half-clues and getting nowhere? I mean working together, Evelyn said, her voice gentle. That's what Eleanor wanted. She didn't make the Christmas crown cake by herself, Sophie. She made it with all of us. Sophie frowned, the words sinking in. She remembered watching her grandmother in the kitchen, how Eleanor had always handed off tasks with effortless grace. She never demanded help. She invited it. And somehow, the process of baking together had made the final product taste that much sweeter. Okay, Sophie said slowly. So maybe we're missing people? Evelyn's eyes lit up. Exactly. Sophie grabbed her phone again, this time dialing her older sister, Emma. Emma picked up on the second ring, her voice frazzled. Sophie, if this is about me bringing green beans tomorrow, I swear. It's not, Sophie interrupted. I need your help. Can you come over, like, right now? Right now? Emma sounded incredulous. Sophie, it's 10 o'clock, and the kids are finally asleep. I'm not dragging myself out into the snow because you burned a turkey or something. It's not the turkey. It's Grandma's cake, the Christmas crown cake. There was a long silence. Then Emma sighed. You're actually trying to make that thing? You're braver than I thought. It's not just about the cake, Sophie said, her voice urgent. It's about bringing everyone together. Please, Em, I can't do this without you. Another pause. Sophie held her breath. Fine, Emma said at last, but I'm not staying all night. Sophie smiled, relief flooding through her. Thank you. Just bring yourself and maybe some wine. By the time Emma arrived, bundled in a parka and carrying a half-empty bottle of Merlot, the kitchen was buzzing with energy. Sophie explained everything, the clues, the notes, the stars sent together, the three of them set to work. Emma's kids even got involved when they woke up from the noise, giggling as they helped sift powdered sugar and roll cranberries in sugar crystals. The kitchen, once quiet and cold, was now alive with laughter and movement, just as Sophie remembered from her childhood. And as they worked, Sophie began to understand what her grandmother had meant all along. The recipe wasn't just in the book, it was in the people. The Christmas crown cake wasn't meant to be made alone. As the clock struck midnight, the cake was almost complete. But as Sophie prepared to sprinkle the powdered sugar stars over the cranberries, she realized they were missing one crucial element. The final note in the recipe book, the one they hadn't deciphered yet, still lingered in her mind. "What about the jewels?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with worry. Evelyn smiled mysteriously. "There's one more step." Sophie turned to her mother, her heart racing. "What step?" Evelyn pulled something from her bag, a small vial of liquid wrapped in tissue paper. "The secret ingredient," she said. "It's time you knew." Sophie stared at the small vial in her mother's hand. It was no bigger than a shot glass, its contents a golden liquid that glinted faintly in the kitchen light. She furrowed her brow, confused. "What is that?" she asked, glancing between her mother and the vial. Sophie's fingers trembled as she watched her mother unwrap the small vial. The kitchen fell silent, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Her heart raced. Was this it? The answer to the mystery that had consumed her for days? Evelyn's expression softened as she carefully revealed the vial, her eyes glistening with something Sophie couldn't quite name. Pride? Nostalgia? Love? Evelyn smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "It's Eleanor's vanilla extract." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "Grandma made her own extract?" "She did," Evelyn said, her voice quiet. "She started the tradition years ago, before you were born. Every fall, she'd soak vanilla beans in bourbon, let it steep for months, and use it in all her holiday baking. She called it her liquid magic." Evelyn chuckled softly. She used to say it wasn't just vanilla, it was infused with all the love and care she poured into every dish. Sophie took the vial, holding it as though it might shatter. The weight of it was heavier than she expected, a physical reminder of her grandmother's presence. "This is the secret ingredient?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "It's one of them," Evelyn said, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "But the real secret isn't in the bottle. It's in what we're doing right now, working together, sharing stories, remembering her." Emma, who had been watching quietly, nodded. "She always said the cake wasn't about perfection. It was about the love you put into it." Sophie glanced at the nearly completed cake on the counter. It was beautiful, golden, and fragrant, topped with glistening, sugared cranberries, but it still felt incomplete. She uncorked the vial and inhaled deeply. The scent was intoxicating, warm, rich, and deeply familiar. Evelyn handed her a small brush. "Just a light touch over the cranberries," she said. Sophie dipped the brush into the extract and delicately painted it over the sugared fruit. The cranberries caught the light, shimmering like jewels, and the warm vanilla bourbon scent filled the air. As Sophie worked, a memory surfaced, done she hadn't thought about in years. She was 8 years old, sitting on a stool in Eleanor's kitchen, watching her grandmother drizzle the same golden liquid over a fresh batch of cookies. "Why do you do that, Grandma?" Sophie had asked. Eleanor had smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Because it makes everything shine. Even the simplest things deserve a little magic, don't you think?" Now, standing in her own kitchen with her mother and sister by her side, Sophie felt that same magic. It wasn't just in the cake, it was in the moment. By the time the cake was finished, it was nearly 1 a.m. The three women stood back to admire their work. The Christmas crown cake glistened under the soft glow of the kitchen lights, its sugared cranberries sparkling like tiny stars. A delicate dusting of powdered sugar completed the effect, creating a halo of frost-like beauty. "It's perfect," Emma said, her voice full of awe. "No," Evelyn corrected gently, "it's imperfect, and that's what makes it perfect." Sophie couldn't help but smile. The cake wasn't exactly like Eleanor's, it was smaller, and the stars were slightly uneven, but it was theirs. As they cleaned up the kitchen, laughter and quiet conversation filled the space. Emma shared stories about her kids' antics, Evelyn reminisced about her own childhood Christmases, and Sophie found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in years, connected. The next evening, the Greer family gathered at Sophie's house. The dining table was crowded with dishes, roasted vegetables, glazed ham, cranberry sauce, but all eyes were on the Christmas crown cake sitting proudly in the center. "You actually did it," Uncle Pete said, whistling in admiration. "I didn't think anyone would dare try after Eleanor." "It wasn't just me," Sophie said, glancing at Evelyn and Emma. "We made it together." As the family sat down to eat, the usual chaos ensued: kids spilling drinks, Uncle Pete telling his same old jokes, and Emma's youngest sneaking a sugared cranberry before dessert was served. But beneath the noise and laughter, Sophie felt an unmistakable warmth. Sophie glanced around the table, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. The sound of laughter filled the room, louder and freer than it had been in years. Emma was leaning over, wiping her youngest's chin, while Evelyn quietly refilled Uncle Pete's glass. The scene felt almost surreal. This chaotic, imperfect gathering was exactly what she'd dreamed of. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, the empty space at the table didn't feel so heavy. It felt full of love, of memory, of hope. When it came time to cut the cake, Evelyn stood and raised her glass. "I think Eleanor would be proud," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just of the cake, but of the love and effort that went into it. She always believed Christmas wasn't about things, it was about people. About us. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat as the family clinked their glasses. For a moment, she could almost feel Eleanor's presence, as though her grandmother were sitting at the table, smiling quietly. The first slice of cake was passed to Sophie, and as she took her first bite, she closed her eyes. The flavors were perfect, warm, spiced, and deeply comforting, but it wasn't just the taste that made her smile. It was the memory of making it, the laughter and love that had gone into every step. As the evening wound down, Sophie stood in the kitchen, tidying up while the others lingered in the living room. Evelyn joined her, drying dishes and humming softly. "You did good tonight," Evelyn said, glancing at Sophie. "Thanks," Sophie said a little shyly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Evelyn smiled. "Well, maybe next year you'll carry on the tradition. You've got the recipe now, or at least your own version of it." Sophie nodded, feeling a quiet pride. "I think I will." Evelyn reached for the recipe book, flipping it open to the spice list. Beneath it, she scribbled a quick note in the margin. "Recreated on Christmas Eve with Sophie and Emma, Eleanor's magic lives on." Sophie watched her mother's hand move across the page, her chest swelling with emotion. The book wasn't just a collection of recipes, it was a living history, a testament to the Greer family's resilience and love. As Evelyn closed the book, she handed it to Sophie. "It's yours now, keep adding to it." Sophie nodded, cradling the book like a treasure. Later that night, as Sophie lay in bed, she thought about Eleanor's star, the one she used to draw on everything, the one that had guided them through the recipe. She smiled, realizing the true meaning of her grandmother's words. The star wasn't just a symbol. It was a reminder to follow the light, even in the darkest moments, and to trust that love would guide the way. With that thought, Sophie drifted off to sleep, the scent of spices and vanilla lingering in her dreams. In the quiet of the night, the Christmas crown cake sat on its pedestal in the kitchen, its sugared stars shimmering faintly in the moonlight, a testament to the magic of family and the love that kept them together. As Sophie turned off the kitchen lights and stole one last glance at the cake, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The recipe wasn't just in the book, nor even in the ingredients, it was in the moments shared, the hands that came together, and the stories that bound them. And in that moment, she knew the star's light would always guide her home.